And with that kind of pathfinding, Christopher Columbus would have ended up in Greenland.
Well, that could have been an interesting historical shift.
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Computer's playing games on me this morning.
Well, commissioners, appreciate you agreeing to an early morning start. I know what the rest of your morning is going to look like, so it's going to be a very busy day.
Yeah. I did have a conversation with Mayor Grover yesterday afternoon.
Okay.
So
All right, we'll see how many times my camera can go in and out of focus here. So Scott, how are you doing?
Doing well. We're staying busy over here.
Sounds like it. Al, how's your morning? Other than
just another day in paradise.
yeah, another day of looking at fiscal irresponsibility.
Yes.
Oh, that's insane.
Kitty, good morning.
Good morning. Sorry, I had a really hard time getting that link out of the Outlook calendar and into my personal devices so that I could do this. Our system at the city doesn't have Zoom.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, it's annoying. It's blocked off of our phones. And so
What do you use? Google Meet?
WebEx
Oh,
and Microsoft Teams.
yeah.
Okay. We can take that into account. I had no idea that you didn't have even Zoom capability. But sure, we can figure out a different platform.
I think for me, it's just easier if you email the Zoom link rather than embed it in my Microsoft calendar. Because you can't forward something out of your calendar on the city system, but you can forward an email.
Yeah.
Okay. Lots of complications, but
oh yes, government.
Well, we're well into our start time, and I know many of you have a very busy morning. So maybe Commissioner French, I guess, as the vice chair, I would turn this over to you and see if we can get started.
Well, I appreciate that, but I think you're the leader of the parade on this one here. So why don't you go ahead and lead, and I'll just follow.
Okay. Well, we did send out the original ILA and the first some ideas from our side on some quick updates. I can share that I think I can share that quickly here. This document, and we simply, about as simple as we could, we simply added the tribes into the language, and then recognized a little bit later in the document a couple of not errors, but updates on timing, because this original ILA dates to the birth of GMA. So it talks about, in section 3, it talks about establishing starting dates for interim urban growth areas, and those are just long past the issue. So we did a couple of those things, but the suggestion was to simply how is the easiest way to put the tribal representatives in here, and we simply listed them, and we put one each as a voting member, and that was kind of the suggestion. So very much open to any other ideas. And of course, like a constitutional convention, once you open the ILA, it's certainly optional to look at anything else that any of you as electeds want to revise or consider.
Well, are there any areas or flaws in the existing ILA that you're aware of, Scott, that we ought to be paying attention to?
Not necessarily. I guess when we did this part of section 3, this was just kind of a cleanup from old days. There was one other spot, for example, here in B, minimum levels of service. We moved that into everybody's individual capital facilities program planning, so that that could be a cleanup error. And then there was one down here that my personal opinion, having this 2/3 vote just seemed like a more burdensome version of doing things than we might need. But that was just kind of reading it as from my side. There's no county position, or certainly no planning position on that. But those were really kind of the only things that jumped out as really anything that we might want to consider. And the rest of it is still pretty straightforward.
So let's go back to that 2/3. The 2/3 voting is threshold is required on what issues?
Countywide planning policies, if we were to amend them more frequently than the recommended up here, which is talking about every 5-year period. In other words, if we were to look at it annually, we would need a 2/3 vote of the steering committee essentially to open debate on that, rather than changing that to saying, we could review them annually. And I understand where maybe this came from. The idea of having countywide planning policies is to provide some stability and a foundation for our work in comprehensive planning, and so you don't necessarily want to make it easy to change, but on the other hand, getting a 2/3 vote just seemed like an added step that maybe more than we need. On the other hand, if there's that sort of consensus to amend them, then there's probably no error, no harm, no foul.
Well, and I think the other observation I'd like to throw in here, just for historical purposes, is that after jurisdictions adopted their comprehensive land use plans, technically we're not required to have a steering committee of elected officials. The county has elected to continue to have this program in place because it provides an opportunity for, not only collaboration, but also to grow as a region, as opposed to growing its individual communities and stuff. But so the steering committee is purely an advisory body to the Board of County Commissioners. So I guess coming back to the comment about the 2/3 majority, if it's advisory only, then why do you need a threshold? Then I'm not campaigning to get rid of it. I'm just asking a question because I'm not sure that the atmosphere that created that exists today. So that just throwing it out there. Yeah, Kitty.
Well,
Thanks. I think I know why it's a 2/3 majority. I think it's because since this is advisory to the county commissioners, like if you have like a really minor, like shaving, tough, close vote on something, it's not as strong of a recommendation as when 2/3 of people agree. So I think maybe that was the reason why. I don't feel passionately about it, but I think they probably just wanted strong consensus so that people have buy-in and people feel like a recommendation from this committee, the way it's governed at least, is supported by a 2/3 majority. That's the only thing I can think of.
Okay.
And I guess just to kind of keep us focused here, the point of this group is to make sure we're amending these for tribal participation,
Right.
not
Yeah.
necessarily down into the weeds here, but
you were the one that highlighted it. I didn't.
fair enough. Fair enough.
well, I mean, I would be in support of a simple majority, especially if it's just an advisory body to bring a motion forward rather than having 2/3. But I mean, I can understand, a stronger consensus of the steering committee as far as the 2/3 is concerned, but I think it should just be a simple majority.
Well, we can certainly raise the issue when we go back to the full body and get a feeling for them.
Right.
But and like I said, I'm not sure. I certainly appreciate the strength that comes with the 2/3 recommendation, but it's still a recommendation, and it's not as though the Board of County Commissioners doesn't have representation on the steering committee. We do. So if there's passion around it, we're clearly going to know it because we're in the room. Unless you guys decide to kick us out, which might not be no, I'm just kidding. Going back to the issue with the tribes, any concern with that structure? I mean, quite frankly, it's very similar to what we did for SRTC when we had to add the tribes to that membership as well. Yeah, any thoughts there?
No, I mean, I definitely support both tribal entities being voting members.
Yeah, I'd rather have both of them there than try and pick one representative to represent both tribes. And that we went down that road with SRTC and ran into the wall and decided to back away from that. So we've got both tribes represented on SRTC as well. And both of them have different aspirational goals in terms of what they want to do. So they both ought to be able to speak for themselves. So Kitty, do you have any concern here?
Looks good to me.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I guess you got three people saying go forth.
We will clean this up a little bit and we will prepare it for the steering committee, at least as a report next week. And if there's if we can see a general consensus, we'll put it up for action at the steering committee's September meeting.
Okay, Kitty.
Scott had also highlighted whether or not non-voting members need to be elected officials, but I just thought that was an interesting question. I don't have any feelings about it. I just wondered why you flagged it. Thought it was interesting.
Thank you. I had forgotten about that. There was a comment made at the steering committee meeting by I don't know if it was Tim or one of the three non-voting members that perhaps they should be voting members instead of non-voting members. We as staff, we have no strong opinions on that either way, but certainly traditionally the voting members of the steering committee are elected by their, legislative bodies, and school districts, fire districts, water districts are not so much part of that. So I can see where their representation is important, but having a vote is, I would say one of those statements is like, that's above my pay grade. That's entirely up to you and the steering committee.
And we debated this issue, God, a long time ago. I'm thinking back, maybe even when I was on the city council, but actually had quite a bit of debate about this because we were having trouble with, and as my memory serves me right, we were fine with water, we were fine with the fire, but the school representative would rarely show up, and so the excuse was, well, he's not a voting member, or she's not a voting member, didn't matter. And so we debated it, and finally came to the conclusion that if an individual is not being able to make the meeting, then maybe they ought to change the individual instead of changing the whole policy for the rest of the organization. So that's why we left it the way it is, the non-voting members.
And we only have one school representative?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's interesting considering how big the districts are getting.
Yeah, well, I mean, the same thing with fire districts. I mean, you got fire districts throughout the entire county, except for the city of Spokane. So, it's treating the school districts, the fire districts, and, quite frankly, the water districts are actually fewer. But that was the logic. Good, bad, or indifferent, that was the logic.
Okay.
And I can see some of the threads back to the original Growth Management Act adoption, where school districts were included in GMA, and the governor at the time vetoed that section primarily, as I understand it, because it also involved port districts, and he didn't want the port districts to be somehow part of the GMA planning. So that took school districts out of having to plan using the Growth Management Act, which is kind of a giant pain for us in the county, because they, if we're doing growth and working on that side, the districts work in a totally different kind of system, and it ends up being disconnected when a subdivision is going here, but the school district only does their planning when they get to capacity, and they say, we're out of room now, we need a new bond to build a new structure of some kind.
It's always an emergency, and we have to find land and put it somewhere inappropriate.
Exactly.
And then it causes a bunch of growth around it. Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
Don't you love a plan? Don't you love a plan that works? Right.
Yeah.
So
I can see that. So I mean, like I said, I can see where they're excluded as a voting member, because the steering committee is, well, it's a creature of the county board, to be sure, but it's also a creature of GMA. And so since they're not subject to GMA, should they really have a vote on growth? And a purely practical observation, all of you have seen at almost every meeting how we get started and we're counting for a quorum. Adding 3 more voting members is going to change that quorum count. It may make it a little more difficult, unless, of course, the individuals are attending regularly. So
That's fair.
You remind me of another element as part of the earlier conversation, is that funding for fire districts and funding for water districts are locally controlled. Funding for school districts are for a great deal controlled at the state level, and we don't have the state at the table to help us. And it gets back to what Kitty was saying. You got to wait until you get the count. By that time, the land that you should have put a school in is gone. So, but that was part of the other conversation, is that the school districts don't have local control or authority.
well, and something that comes up quite often with us in Airway Heights, especially with our needs for schools and whatnot, it's always trying to find well, do we go for or against the Cheney School District and what they're trying to do and whatnot. But I definitely can see having electeds on just for the accountability purpose, rather than those that potentially were non-elected officials. being voting members. But, you know, in regard to the school districts and whatnot, I think that, you know, not having them necessarily as voting members can also, you know, strengthen their ties with their local jurisdictions, with the cities that surround them. I mean, if they want to lobby for something, you know, there's no reason why we can't have that conversation, you know, and we can bring it to the table as well. And I think that especially if you look at how the school districts are structured as far as their jurisdictional boundaries, it's kind of all over the place too.
Yeah. And again, perhaps for this purpose, staying focused on the tribal membership amendment and bringing that to the steering committee is something that is, I think, pretty universally supported. The other non-voting members becoming voting members, maybe that's a discussion for another day.
Thanks. The background was super interesting. I appreciate all of your time.
Okay. If I'm hearing the consensus, again, we'll prepare a document for the steering committee next week and bring it up for a report.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
All right. You as well.